Hi, this is Jeff Gill. Welcome to our Brexit case study. We developed this as an example of how Schirmer's Neuralink system can be used to analyze and optimize political communications. Schirmer and Bellwether Citizens Response conducted this study at the Innovation Center in Dublin Centre University during the height of the Brexit discussions. 28 participants were shown 33 video clips of about 20 seconds each of 11 politicians speaking on Brexit in a randomized order. The study provided a lot of insight into how Dublin voters responded to politicians. We were somewhat surprised by some of the emotional response rate results. While not completely surprising, Donald Trump evoked the highest emotional response. When you think about it, however, it is pretty amazing that he can generate that response among Irish voters when speaking on a subject that he's only peripherally involved in. Perhaps more surprising, Irish politicians generated the least response. Also, emotional response rates did not reflect the positions of the politicians on the subject of Brexit. This contrasts with how people consciously rated their approval of the politicians, which was completely aligned with their position on Brexit. In some regards, this result is not surprising because you would expect the conscious response to be relatively rational. One of the great advantages of using neuroscience techniques is that we can capture response on a moment-by-moment basis. This allows us to identify what specifically is reaching voters on an emotional basis. Even some of the politicians that were low on average hit high moments. This provides an opportunity for them to learn how to improve. We also found that the way the discussion was framed had a different impact on supporters versus opposers of Brexit. This is a subtle point, but quite important. The more pro-exit a Brexit person was, the more they responded to positively framed statements. The more anti-Brexit the people were, the more they responded to negatively framed statements. By adjusting how you frame a statement, you can adjust how it impacts people on an emotional level. Finally, we were able to identify and quantify the impact of a key priming event. Perhaps the most important takeaway from this case study is that Neuralink provides a tool to identify and quantify these effects objectively. No longer do researchers need to rely on the subjective opinions of so-called experts to understand the non-conscious response. On the following pages, we share some of the analysis that led to the key conclusions summarized here. Let's start with how people say they feel about the politicians. We asked people to rank the politicians from 1 to 11, with 1 being the most favored and 11 being the least. What we found were that these conscious favorability ratings lined up directly with the politicians' positions on Brexit. Politicians who supported Brexit were regarded much less favorably than politicians who opposed Brexit. Since this audience was highly opposed to Brexit on average, this means that their favorability ratings matched how aligned they were to the positions of the politicians. Since favorability is a conscious decision, it's not surprising it lines up with the alignment on positions. It seems like an eminently rational choice. However, we know that rational conclusions are only a small part of the overall decision-making process. Emotions drive a large part of the decision-making process and can tell a completely different story. This graph shows the average emotional response rate for each politician. If we show those that oppose Brexit, we see that they are spread out from the second highest response to the lowest response. Those that support Brexit are also spread out. Those that are in the middle of the road may be a little more clustered in the middle, but we do not see any discernible pattern. Another interesting result is that the 2 Irish politicians, Arlene Foster and Simon Coveney, score lowest on our response rates. Even though Foster supports Brexit and Coveney opposes it, this is unlikely to be a familiarity bias because we do not see that bias in any of the other data. We often look at the conscious and biometric responses on a single plot that psychologists call an arousal valence plot. It's very useful because it gives an instant view on a single plot of the whole picture. Biometrics, which measures psychological arousal, the strength of the emotional response, is on the vertical axis. Valence, positive or negative response, is on the horizontal axis. We measured the valence with the favorability question. Some key observations that immediately pop out. Donald Trump generates the highest emotional response but is viewed least favorably. This does not seem like a good place to be, but if the audience positions were aligned with his, this high emotional response would be very powerful. This is likely the reason that his supporters are so devoted to him. At the opposite end, Simon Coveney is viewed favorably, but his inability to generate response would severely limit his ability to motivate people to action. Donald Tusk has the best combination for this audience, high favorability and relatively high emotional response, although he's unlikely to be able to generate the enthusiasm among his followers that Donald Trump does. Let's take a look at some of the key moments of high response during the session. Donald Trump had the highest response rates on average of any politician in the study. An example of one of his high points is when he said, "I think Brexit is going to be a wonderful thing for your country." Let me explain our chart. The graph below the screenshot shows the instantaneous response rates during the entire clip. The grid lines indicate 0, 50, and 100% levels from low to high. The blue line indicates the percentage of people having a response at that instant. The red line indicates the percentage of people having a high response at that instant. The vertical line indicates the approximate time of the midpoint of the statement in quotes. Thus, it provides a good example of how many people are responding to the statement. In this case, the response rate peaks out at about 70%, so 70% of the audience had an emotional response to that statement, one of the highest in the whole study. Given that the audience was highly anti-Brexit, one can infer that it was not a positive response, but the simplicity of the message was great at generating response. The response, however, tailed off as Trump repeated his message in different words. In contrast, Donald Tusk's comments were aligned well with the audience's perspective, but the response was never as high as Trump's. Although his message wasn't overly complex, he probably would have benefited from simplifying it even more. Nigel Farage is another politician that the audience disagreed with, but his simple, clear message, "Let me tell you what I want," generated a high response. One of the great benefits of tracking response rates over time is being able to identify what really resonates with an audience. For example, the response to Nancy Pelosi was in the middle of the pack overall, but she really hit a high with the audience when she stressed that they cannot jeopardize the Good Friday Accord that brought peace to Ireland after decades of conflict. She could potentially take this information and make her oratory even more powerful. The data generated from Neuralink can also be used to do much more sophisticated analyses than just spotting high points. For example, in this study, we looked at how framing statements impacted how the audience responded. Although there were only 2 people who were actually pro-Brexit, more people were not completely opposed. These relatively pro-exit people tended to respond to more positive framing. In contrast, adamantly anti-Brexit people responded more to negative framing. This suggests that you can improve the impact of your message by understanding the position of your audience and framing your message appropriately. Finally, we reviewed the whole experience and found an event that changed the nature of how the audience responded to the stimuli. One clip near the middle of the stimuli showed John Bercow, the speaker, trying vainly to regain control of an unruly House of Commons by shouting, "Order!" This immediate response rate on this clip was quite high, but it also changed the overall trend in arousal for the audience. Let me explain. This graph shows our response rate metric over the whole session with a number of the high points labeled. As you can see, Berkow's clip generates a high response, but the response rates before and after the clip seem relatively unchanged. This is because the response rate metric measures the short-term response to a stimulus, which is called the phasic response by psychologists. However, The overall long-term arousal level, called the tonic response, is also important. It measures the overall state of alertness rather than just the response to a specific stimulus. To get at the tonic response, we z-score the individual raw GSR signals to normalize them so that their means are 0 and their standard deviations are 1. We then average the result across all individuals to get a measure of the overall arousal level of the audience. The resulting graph is below. It is clear from this graph that the Burkow clip had a major and lasting impact on the audience. Going through the graph from the start of the experience, you can see that the overall trend is steadily down. This is quite common because people relax over time as they get used to the process. However, the Burkow clip effectively woke everyone up because it was so different. After the clip, the heightened state of arousal continued for some time as the audience wondered whether or not another surprise was coming in the next clip. Psychologists call this kind of effect priming. Priming can be very powerful, and Neuralink provides the tools to identify and measure it. We hope you enjoyed this case study. We were able to understand the response participants had to individual politicians and how the response changed depending on the framing of the statement. We were also able to identify and measure the impact of a significant priming event. For more information on this case study or on the technology used, visit Neuralink.com or email us at info@shimmersensing.com. Thank you.